Hello everybody. So this will be my first video that I made this summer, which goes against my original plan completely. But I suppose I took time to really pay some serious attention to some of the parts of reality that I've been neglecting in a way. Not neglecting consciously, but just because my time was split so much between different things. And since I was on summer break, I was able to devote the time that I think I needed to learning more about these things. So that's my explanation for the long gap in videos. And I have noticed that over the last year to 2 years, it seems that my focus in my reading has slowly been shifting. And I think it's gotten to at this point, the shift is pretty noticeable. And I think you'll see that in this video if you watch it. So I've been reading seriously now for about 10 years, which is pretty crazy for me because that's more than a third of my life at this point. And that's one of the good things about this YouTube channel, because I can look back and I can see different ways I thought about things in the past, which can be hard to do unless you keep a diary of some kind, or if you interacted with friends and then there's a large gap, they remember how you used to be and you're different now, and they can maybe tell you. But the gradual change day to day, you just morph into a different person. But yeah, I started this channel by wanting to share lesser known books that I thought deserved focus and more readers. And I think in a way I'm still doing that, but not in the sense of prose fiction or poetry quite as much. It's more I suppose like more strict classics, like you'll see in a second. A couple of the topics I've been more interested in lately: linguistics, especially Indo-European linguistics, because that's by far the most studied language family that's published in English, or really any European language. One of the groups of family languages I want to look into a lot more soon is Bantu languages. Swahili is probably the most widely known of that. And then been interested a lot in kind of more civilizational scale studies of human history, and political studies of the last 20 years, especially relating to America, and then also stuff in the direction of environmentalism, sustainability, and that kind of thing. And you'll see that from some of the books I'm going to talk about. So first, in this video, we'll see how far I get, but I'm going to talk about the books I've read this summer. This isn't all of them, but this is a representative selection. It's the majority of the books I read this summer. It's totally different. If you had asked me, May 31st, oh, what are you going to read this summer? I would have picked maybe 2 of these books. Yeah, maybe 2. But I went on a road trip, got some books that I wasn't anticipating finding. Also, just some, just the way things do. You end up interested in a different topic, and that topic leads you to a different topic that you wouldn't have, looked into if you didn't find the original one, and so on. So that was kind of the way I did it. But we will start with the first book that I'm going to talk about here that I finished this summer, which is a book I've had for a while. And it's an author I've already talked about on this channel. And that was Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald. The other Sebald book I've read is Rings of Saturn, which I've been meaning to reread, but I just haven't gotten to that yet. But I distinctly remember reading Rings of Saturn, and that's what got me onto the whole Thomas Browne and just, endless trajectory of reading from Rings of Saturn. But Austerlitz was W.G. Sebald's final book. It came out in 2001, and he tragically died in a car wreck in 2001. It has the same characteristics of Rings of Saturn as earlier work, where the tone is very melancholic, and somehow he's able to discursively pass from his view from topic to topic seamlessly. You can't even really, if you look at it closely, you can't really figure out where the switch happens. And this is one where he also includes photographs. So let's see. Oh, yeah. But yeah, he has this character, Jacques Austerlitz, who is adopted by a Welsh couple right before World War II starts. And the book it follows the trajectory of the revelations that Austerlitz has discovering his own past, because he's not really given much information about his past from his adopted family, and then he's gone on a very winding path to figure things out. You end up finding out that he was sent away from his home because he was going to be sent to the, I think I'm saying it right, to Regenstadt ghetto concentration camp. And his family sends him away voluntarily. And I was fascinated to find out that Friedrich Munzer, who was one of the originators of prosopography, the study of familial and political networks in history. Ronald Sim is notable for that kind of study for ancient Rome. Friedrich Munzer started with ancient Rome. Now it's gone to founding fathers and American history and so on, Byzantine Empire. But it started with the Roman Republic and Roman Empire. Friedrich Munzer died in the Theresienstadt concentration camp, even though he was born, I believe, in 1863 or something, really early. He was a very old man. And I also have this book of poems, writings, and drawings that were made by children in the Theresienstadt concentration camp, only 100 of which survived. And out of the, I don't know, what was it, 15,000 or 1,500, some huge number. So it's highly likely that if Austerlitz had been real and had actually been sent to this concentration camp, he would not have survived, and we wouldn't have this story. And that's one thing that I really appreciate about W.G. Sebald. And I wish more writers wrote like him in this way, that he writes about things that actually matter. It's not simply language games. It's not, just intellectual fireworks with no meaningful foundation. He writes about things that actually matter and have inherent weight and significance. And that's something that I didn't realize it really, but I was really needing to read. And I think, in a way, I'm just figuring it out, that's probably what, it's W.G. Sebald is what destroyed my summer reading plans. So I will always thank him for that. But it follows in the trajectory of Passenger and Stella Maris, the significance of those, which I'm very grateful for. So, first book, Austerlitz. Next was a book I knew about, but it's by a writer I hadn't read before. I've heard of him because he's very influential in the Southwest, especially journalism. And the book I was most interested in is what I'm going to show you. I found it at a bookstore in Salt Lake City, Ken Sanders Rare Books, an amazing bookstore. If you're ever in Salt Lake City is one of the weirdest cities I've ever been to in my life. I haven't been outside the U.S., but it almost felt like I was in a foreign country. But that Rare bookstore is amazing. So if you ever get a chance. The book I'm going to be talking about is Juárez, The Laboratory of Our Future by Charles Bowden. And as you can see, it has a preface by Noam Chomsky and then an afterword by Eduardo Galeano. So I was interested in this writer because he usually comes up when you look up Southwest writers. I've been interested in Southwest writers ever since I've lived in Texas. My favorite professor at UT Austin, one of the only good professors I had out of 3 or 4 good ones out of the however many I had to deal with. He taught a class, Don Graham taught a class on Southwest literature. We read all, fiction, but it got me interested in that as like a regional focus. I really like looking at regional writers rather than writers from, California, New York. Those are pretty much, the vast majority of popular writers in America. It's gotten a little better in recent years, but they're still mostly the unfair focus of things. But Charles Bowden was born in the 40s, I believe, and there's a couple good interviews by him on YouTube. I should be able to remember to link to my favorite one. He got a job at a university, studied university, got a job as a professor. He's on the tenure track, and he found that path untenable for him, for his future. And so he ended up getting into an interesting overlap of journalism and anthropology and sociology. His first book is called Killing the Hidden Waters, which is about a Native American group and their water conservation in the Southwest. And I'm fascinated with that one. I haven't read it yet. This is the first book I've read of his, Juárez, The Laboratory of Our Future. But I was interested in this one because I've been, like any of you in the U.S. and outside, I've just been completely horrified by the mistreatment of Latin America in general by the U.S. government over its whole history. But the most recent egregious evil is the mishandling of immigration and refugees. And so I was fascinated. I've been fascinated, 2666 by Bolaño. Daniel Sada writes about the U.S.-Mexico border quite a lot. McCarthy, Border Trilogy. And then, of course, more contemporarily, I've been really focused on it. And this book, Juárez, Laboratory of Our Future, came out in 1998. And that year is important because it's years before 2666 came out, which with its part about the murders, the chapter. And originally I thought Bolaño was prescient in some way. He was ahead of his time. He saw what other people weren't seeing. I realize now, if anything, he was late. He was way ahead of tons of Americans. That's not saying much. Most of them still don't even care or know anything, to their own shame. But this book, 1998, is really, really devastating. So this is where I'll warn. I will be talking about some heavy topics. I will be vacillating between heavy topics and more light topics, I suppose you could say, but just a warning. So if you're ready for it, buckle your seatbelt. So this book started with Charles Bowden going down to Juárez. He lived in New Mexico. I think he went between Las Cruces and just around New Mexico. He lived near cities. And I think it was Las Cruces was his main area. And then he would visit Juárez. He ended up meeting some crime photographers. And these are some amazing characters. He writes about them, but Charles Bowden notes that he became friends with these people and he wanted to write about their lives and what they were keeping record of, bearing witness to. No one in the US wanted to publish it. And it turned out that I believe Harper's was willing to publish some of the stuff, and then it ended up being published by Aperture, this, kind of art publisher. And it's in a big copy here. The preface by Noam Chomsky is from 1994, I believe, when NAFTA was passed. And Chomsky basically writes about the inevitable stupid and horrifying effects that it will have, the selfishness of the United States for advocating for it. That wasn't written for this book. It was just put in, and Chomsky, let it happen. I didn't realize that the stuff going on in Juárez today has been going on for 30 years straight. And this book chronicles that. It's really, really a devastating book. I mean, there are pictures of murders in here, dead people. So prepare yourself if you want to read this. I'll kind of broaden out from this book in particular and kind of mention what I've been thinking about a lot. So I think it should give everyone in America pause that one of the most dangerous places on earth is the border between the United States and Mexico. And the United States is causing that violence. We are exporting our own violence onto a country that has significantly less resources to deal with it. Citizens of the United States are funding the cartels that are causing this extreme violence. And it is the fault of people in the United States for this current violence, this 30,000 murders a year, which is just an indefensible number. Hundreds of thousands over the last 30 years that this has been going on. And then a book I'm going to talk about later, you start unraveling the history of this kind of treatment, and makes you think at large scale the value of our current economic system that allows for the free flow of money across international borders, but not for the free flow of people. So that means that places like the United States that have dominated large parts of the globe in recent times, economically dominated, militarily dominated, they get the upper hand, and countries like Mexico just have to take, whatever they can get. That ends up causing corporations in the United States, wealthy investors, to build factories on the border of the United States and Mexico. They build them in Mexico, so even though, they're 10 miles from El Paso, where the minimum wage would have been at the time, I don't know, $5, $4 an hour. They can pay people in Mexico 50 cents an hour, $1 an hour. And during the 90s, there was massive inflation in Mexico, where, the normal meaningless argument from economists is, oh, we pay them less because their cost of living is less. But what if their cost of living is not less? What if you're paying them less because you've destroyed their economy and they're in such a bad position that they have to accept anything they're given, So, what happened? Young people in Mexico, on the border with the wealthiest country on earth, had to work for pennies on the dollar that someone in the United States would have been paid to make the same item. They would have to go to the factory at 4:30 a.m. Many of these people working in the factory, 16-year-old girls, 17-year-old girls. On their way to the factory, they would get kidnapped and, I'm skipping a step in there, and then murdered. These crime photographers would get to the murders before the police would. And some of the photos are in here. They're horrifying to look at. And the even more horrifying realization, I think, is that no meaningful percentage of people in the United States care enough about it to do anything to stop it. They will benefit from the economic exploitation, and they will do nothing to help these people. Our closest neighbor. Canada is basically our top hat. Mexico is our closest meaningful neighbor. Huge population. It's a little more than half the population of the United States. Canada has about the population of the state of Texas. Not a fair comparison. I'll leave it up to you to decide why we treat people in Mexico different than we treat people in Canada. But this book really got me thinking on a trajectory of what about the United States moral code and line of ethics allows us to treat millions of people in such a horrific way. When you look back at groups earlier in the 20th century that are generally reviled, the treatment doesn't look too much different that the United States is forcing on some of these places. So, The Afterword by Eduardo Galeano was excellent. It is just just listen to this. One piece of the final chapter. The city as gas chamber. A peasant is worth less than a cow and more than a hen, I'm told in Paraguay. And in the northeast of Brazil, he who plants has not land, he who has land does not plant. So if that is compelling to you, I highly recommend you read it. And I'll leave you with one of the photographs. So that's the laboratory of our future. Next, I read a book by Ernst Cassirer, The Myth of the State. This one I wanted to read because it's Cassirer, but also I'll actually be teaching an IB program, which if you're not familiar with it, you can look into it. It's It was originated as an outgrowth of the United Nations in the late 40s after World War II ended, and its main goal, its main inspiration was this woman in Switzerland who founded a school whose main goal was an education for peace. This included a focus on world history as opposed to a focus on national history. She started with world history, geography, the globe, and then would place national history relative to world history. It would be a bilingual education. At that time, it was English and French, the two main languages of the UN, and fostering cooperation and diplomacy and educating for peace. And I like that general overall concept. One of the aspects I wanted to focus on with it, at least for my own thinking, so I can plan for what we're going to learn, is the general scope of political arrangement in the West. So he starts out by talking, what is myth? The struggle against myth in the history of political theory, and he starts with Plato, and he ends up going through with Machiavelli. I found Cassirer's views on Machiavelli enlightening. I hadn't thought of it in specifically the way he talks about it. And then this is where you get to a really weird overlap. He goes into Thomas Carlyle. Well, he talks about the Enlightenment after Machiavelli. And then he focuses on Thomas Carlyle from hero worship to race worship. And then he goes into Hegel and his influence on reactionaries, and then the technique of modern political myths. And I thought, I had never heard about Gobineau, the French influence for a lot of American segregationism and, fake race science. He also talks about Spengler as an astrologist, how he was reading a lot of Italian Renaissance astrologers, and then he was reading Spengler at the time, and he couldn't help but see the similarities, which I thought was very funny. But listen to this. Unlike Novalis, Hegel is not interested in the beauty of the state, but in its truth. And according to him, this truth is not a moral one. It is rather the truth which lies in power. Men are as foolish as to forget, in their enthusiasm for liberty of conscience and political freedom, the truth which lies in power. These words, written in 1801, about 150 years ago, contain the clearest and most ruthless program of fascism that has ever been propounded by any political or philosophic writer. This was a very enlightening book for me to read. I love Cassirer. He's one of my favorite 20th century philosophers. He might be my favorite 20th century philosopher. So if you're interested in a really interesting idiosyncratic view of the myth of the state, check this book out. Next, I got to a similarly wide-scale book, Arnold Toynbee, and I read, this is a collection of 2 books. I only read the first one, Civilization on Trial. And I love Toynbee. He's one of my favorite historians. And this book was a series of lectures that he gave from the 1920s to the 1940s. I think it goes to just like 1949, 1950 maybe. And the books I thought were most impressive, first was his view of history. He has a worldwide view, kind of like I was mentioning, this idealistic, educating for peace perspective, treating world history as more important than national history, which I believe 100%. And I think one thing he mentions is that without understanding the history of your own civilization, you can't understand the history of your own state or nation. It's almost self-evident that that's true. But in the United States, at least, such a poor job is done teaching world history that of course, people can't even understand their own nation or their own politics. The stuff he says about Greco-Roman civilization, I wasn't, it made sense. It wasn't too amazing to me. I thought it was really interesting what he said about Islam. His focus was in the late 40s, looking at what Islam could contribute positively to the West, because at that time it was seen very adversarial, as it still is. But he mentioned a couple things that Islam could positively contribute. He talked about encounters between civilizations, and he, I think, rightly predicted the rise of... Actually, he didn't. Yeah, he left out China as a major political power, which is interesting. Historians, of course, aren't very good at predicting the future. They can see general trends, but the specifics are often missed. And then I didn't connect as much with the later lectures. Christianity and civilization, and then the meaning of history for the soul. He advocates for revival of Christianity as some sort of civilization-saving regime that, Western Christendom is the civilization he says that our current global civilization grew out of. The reason we feel so loose and aimless is because we've lost the Christendom part of Western Christendom. I'm not convinced that's the case, that the only path forward is to go backwards. We can use, of course, inspiration from it, and I think we certainly should, but he also made an interesting point about Russia's Byzantine heritage, and I think that has important implications for today. So, highly recommended Civilization on Trial, and then The World in the West, which were the Reith lectures that he gave, and Oppenheimer also gave some Reith lectures. All right, so Toynbee. Next is a new book that just came out this year, End Times by Peter Turchin, which is one of his more popular books. He studies Cleodynamics. Cleo's the muse of history. And this book is subtitled Elites, Counter-Elites, and the Path of Political Disintegration. And one thing I wanted to mention about those other two books that I forgot is I think one valuable thing you can do when reading is, rather than take someone's word as the truth or as even a likely valid way of viewing reality, I think it's also really valuable to be able to view someone's patterns of thinking and kind of distill those patterns and then be able to apply them anywhere yourself, so you don't have to rely on someone else to tell you what to believe. You can decide what is the case for you, what is true for you. And that's the way I viewed how Toynbee wrote this book. Cassirer was more of trying to really convey what these other writers believed, and I think he does a very unbiased job. It was very impressive, and maybe in that way that's his pattern. Toynbee, I really liked the large scope of how he viewed things, and he viewed things not trying to maximize complexity in a frivolous way, where he's trying to make things overly complicated, but he's trying to justifiably understand the complexity of things, which gets us into End Times by Peter Turchin. So Peter Turchin, he started as a population biologist, so he was using computers and data to understand changes in population that had been really difficult to understand in the past because they involved so many changing variables and large amounts of information. He then transferred this style of thinking, this pattern of thought, onto history because, like I just mentioned, Toynbee, he in the late 40s couldn't imagine China as really the next vying superpower because they were having such a rough time in the 1940s. Justifiably, I can understand his viewpoint, why he had so much difficulty seeing it. But then it should lead you to ask, with people like Spangler acting like they can predict the future and doing such a poor job, can the future be predicted at all? Or are we just hopeless? Are we, driving into the future, looking into the rearview mirror? And I think Peter Turchin gives a good argument for the possibility of predicting the future, at least to a more specific I'm trying to think of the right word, more specific simulation than we have previously been able to with just, inside our head. His first necessity for cliodynamics is to amass a large amount of data about a given time in history. He then does that for other times in history, and he compares that information, finds patterns between the different eras, and then by looking at these common patterns in different times, such as revolutionary periods or periods of growth, he then looks at, what could we use in our understanding of patterns of the past to look at today to see our possible paths of going forward. And he develops two very valuable concepts. And again, he's looking at kind of revolutionary times, political disintegration, times that cause civil war or civil unrest, insurgencies, and so on like that. And he finds two striking patterns that show up in many of the examples of revolutionary times in human history. And he has a lot of people helping him with his cliodynamic studies. I won't go into that too much. If you're interested, definitely get the book. He has several appendices where he goes into it. But the two main ideas that I thought were particularly valuable for viewing today, and he rightly recognizes that it's relevant for the United States today. He was famous for, in 2010, predicting that the United States would be in a crisis by 2020. And he was exactly right. The evidence is clear. So the question you might ask is, well, where is this crisis heading? What are our likely paths forward? And he notes two pieces of evidence that allow us to more accurately view the choices or the paths forward. First is the concept of elite overproduction. And one book I've been fascinated with lately is The Power Elite by C. Wright Mills. And that's basically who Peter Turchin is talking about with elite overproduction. So you can think of lawyers, you can think of millionaires, billionaires, you can think of people in higher ranks of the military or people with military training. And so how does elite overproduction happen? Well, it can happen because wealth, based on, such and such a scenario, wealth begins to be accumulated towards the top of the income distribution or wealth distribution, as opposed to broadly delineated across the whole spectrum of population. So this has been something that's been happening since the 1970s in the United States. If you look at a graph, this is Piketty and Emmanuel Saez and all these people. The inflation-adjusted wages for 99% of the United States looks like this. The inflation-adjusted wages and wealth for the top 1% look like this for the last 50 years. And for the bottom, 20, 15%, wages have actually gone down. People are poorer now than 1970. And he kind of goes from 1980, but basically the same pattern. So what does that do? Well, if there are many more millionaires, a certain percentage of those millionaires are likely to engage in politics. And he uses a really striking analogy of musical chairs. So, in a game of musical chairs, you have 10 chairs, you have 10 people. You start taking away chairs, and the people have to, rush for the remaining seats. Well, he imagines it, okay, let's say you have 10 chairs and you have 10 people. Those 10 people are, 10% of elites, whatever. They each have a seat, so they're happy. Everyone gets a seat, no fighting, no breaking of the rules. Good. Now you have 11 people for the 10 seats. Okay, one person lost out, but they were really close. Maybe they'll get it next time. No big deal. Okay, fast forward, you have 20 people for 10 seats. So half are going to lose out. And that causes people to start fighting, cause people to start breaking rules. Then you have, 30 people for 10 seats. Maybe the guns come out. And he mentions a wide variety of different times in world history. And he says, okay, well, who are these elites? Who are we talking about here? And the elite overproduction happens when, let's say, for example, wages stay stagnant in a large imperial country for 50 years. And people think, okay, well, if I just work in a factory, I'm pretty much screwed. So what can I do? Well, they tell me if I go to college and, get a degree, get a PhD or get a law degree or something, get an MD, then I get guaranteed prosperity. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to go to law school, make my $200,000 a year, defend corporations poisoning people, no problem. What happens if you get a law degree, you go into debt, $200,000, and you end up making $50,000 a year and you never get out of debt. And then you see the next guy working at Sullivan and Cromwell defending these corporations poisoning people. You're going to be upset. You're a lawyer, you're highly educated, you're very eloquent, you can read very well, you can get the people going. Okay, that's elite overproduction. Now, the wealth pump is what has created this inequality. The wealth pump is where you get increased inequality in a society, more wealth going to the people who already have wealth, and the people who need the wealth are getting poorer and poorer. That's in the United States right now. It's been going for 50 years. Not many people talk about it because the people in charge like it. All right, and then what's the other aspect that's necessary? It is popular immiseration. So, fairly clear there. This is the people who live in Appalachia, a former coal mine country that they relied on one industry. That one industry left. Now, you have this shocking opioid epidemic, and then this epidemic is going to spread around the United States as people live worse and worse lives relatively. Live worse lives than their parents did. All right, so then he talks about this prototype of a model that he made that predicts by the year 2030 there's going to be a significant drop in the number of elites. So what does that mean? Well, either we have a New Deal situation where, FDR is a traitor to his class and he cranks up, 90% top marginal tax rate, and we have a lessening of elites voluntarily, or, kicking and screaming, but voluntarily, basically. The other extreme is the guillotines come out. And Peter Turchin's point is basically only the elites can decide this. And I think that's basically correct. That's about what I've been seeing. I hope that we have a New Deal. So, End Times by Peter Turchin. I highly recommend reading the whole book. Very valuable. He has other books, Secular Cycles, Historical Dynamics. Those are his more academic focused writings. Historical Dynamics is the only one I have of those, and I've read parts of it. The other one I started reading last year and got through about 2/3 of it, and then I finished it right before the movie Oppenheimer, American Prometheus. And I love the movie. I just feel so lucky that we have a guy like Christopher Nolan making movies, because I think if he wasn't making movies, if something random happened, we would have never had a movie about Oppenheimer. And I agree with Paul Schrader that it's the most important movie of this century so far, the 21st century. But it's fascinating. It's so amazing, the overlaps between this book and the next book I'm going to talk about, which is kind of a popular, more of a loose book than I generally like to read, but it was a quick read and it was pretty engaging. The Devils Chessboard, which is the history of Allen Dulles, the CIA, and the rise of America's secret government. So one overlap between these two books is the influence of Henry Luce, who was the head of Time magazine during the 40s and 50s. He was very good friends with Louis Strauss, the guy you'll know from the Oppenheimer movie, and Allen Dulles. Oddly enough, he was very good friends with both of them, two guys relatively high up in the U.S. government who could control the narrative. Also, the overlap with the Schulzbergers, the family dynasty of the New York Times. Allen Dulles was very good friends with them too. Allen Dulles worked at Sullivan and Cromwell, the same law firm that Peter Thiel worked at. And you start to notice these overlaps. Another overlap is Curtis LeMay's name comes up quite often in both. So where does it come up in the Oppenheimer biography? Oppenheimer advocated against building larger nukes and more nukes at various times in his life. He did struggle with this question, but he was pretty adamant that he thought there should not be a larger bomb than the bomb types designed at Los Alamos. They shouldn't build the super, as Edward Teller was obsessed with, the hydrogen bomb, the fusion bomb. Curtis LeMay didn't like this idea. He's the satirical core of Dr. Strangelove, the movie. The general who wants to bomb the Soviets to smithereens before they can retaliate. Curtis LeMay was in charge of the Strategic Air Command. Oppenheimer didn't get along well with him, and Oppenheimer was ousted, fake, charges against his security clearance. The name comes up again in The Devil's Chessboard. Curtis LeMay wanted to increase the power of the military-industrial complex, and he wanted to get as many nukes as possible ready for his bombers to drop on the USSR to cause a worse Holocaust than what Germany caused. Allen Dulles notably became friends and associates with many ex-Nazis. He helped some of them get out of Nazi Germany. He helped some of them avoid war crimes trials at the Nuremberg trials. And as you see on the back, Allen Dulles' name comes up in a lot of conspiracy theories of JFK's assassination. But one of the most horrifying stories that I read in The Devil's Chessboard, well, there were really two. So the whole story of how the coup in Guatemala in 1954 went over. The CIA planned a coup to remove, his name is slipping from my mind, Jacopo Arbenz, I think is his name, the democratically elected leader of Guatemala, instituting land reform, taking some land away from the United Fruit Company, and the CIA planned a coup and got him out of power and got a dictator in power. Horrifying stuff. But I think one story captures this so-called secret government the best. So, Spanish Civil War, there's a man named Galindez that leaves Spain, and Trujillo of the Dominican Republic gave sanction to some of the people fleeing Franco's Spain. Well, Galindez is able to see what's going on in Trujillo's Dominican Republic. He's horrified by it. He leaves and he gets refuge in the United States in New York City. He ends up at Columbia. He ends up as a professor there, and he's writing a dissertation that ends up being 750 pages on the true history of the Trujillo administration. Well, Trujillo finds out about this, and he hires some ex-CIA guys from the Mayhew group to kidnap this now American resident, drug him in the United States, kidnap him illegally, and drop him off in Trujillo's Dominican Republic so that Trujillo can torture him to death like a cartel would today. The people who kidnapped Galindez were American. The person who flew him on a plane was a 23-year-old aspiring pilot who was living in the Dominican Republic. And after this torture execution was committed from a man kidnapped from the United States, the pilot, the 23-year-old pilot, was heard bragging about this in a bar in the Dominican Republic. He was then kidnapped, an American citizen, and tortured to death also. There was a big, outcry. Nothing happened. This guy, David Talbot, also alleges that this Mayhew group was involved with the JFK assassination, which, at this point wouldn't surprise me. But, of course, there's no definitive evidence. Allen Dulles planned the Bay of Pigs invasion, which JFK didn't allow to go off to his plan, and then removed him from power. JFK is assassinated, and then Allen Dulles was on the Warren Commission, the commission that was supposed to study JFK's assassination. Highly suspect. So it's an interesting read. I think the better parts are the parts before the JFK assassination talk. He gets a little loose with his associations and connections in the JFK part, but it was an interesting read. So not the highest level history, but it's worth reading. And then this gets me on my last connection here, kind of a long video. I'll try to speed this next part up. The Sunflower Forest by William Jordan III. So this is a book I read about halfway through a while ago, and then I kind of paused it because I got onto other things. And then lately I was more interested in this topic, so I started reading it again and finished it. So this is about ecological restoration of landscapes. And it's a fascinating book. What I think is most important about this book is that he doesn't simply talk about the current state of things. Things are, much less than ideal, but he gives a hopeful view for the future, which I think is vital whenever you're talking about a significant problem. He has a lot of really interesting stuff to say about ritual too. So I'm going to talk about that in my next couple books I'm going to look at. All right, so I'm going to have to skip a couple books I wanted to talk about, but that'll be for another time. All right, so this leads me to the 3 books I'm currently reading. Those are all ones I've finished. These are ones I'm currently reading. The first one is A Small Farm Future, which I'll probably finish reading after I make this video, by Chris Smaje, published by Chelsea Green Publishing. This book talks about the 10 crises that are currently happening right now. If you know Daniel Schmachtenberger, he's been really fascinating to look into the last couple of years for me. He's part of the reason I'm reading some of this stuff. He talks about the meta crisis, so quick run through of them. You have, looming biosphere collapse. You have crisis of capital, economic exploitation, political economy, health and nutrition issues. People are dying of being too fat. Crisis of land, overpopulation, water, PFAS and all water on Earth, too much garbage, soil degradation. Let's see what else he talks about. The energy crisis, fossil fuels, climate, of course, and then I think, his first one is population. So, what do we do about all these crises? Do we just give up and hope the whole thing collapses, become reactionaries, and give up all critical thought? No. What we can do is what he advocates, Small Farm Future. I'll talk about this book more when I'm finished reading it, because I think it's really interesting. But he gives an argument for building resilience into our current system rather than relying on things that fell apart during COVID, international supply chains, et cetera, the whole deal. Very compelling book. It's interesting. I have some problems with it, but it's interesting overall. The other book I'm reading in the same realm is Overshoot by William Catton. And this is a book I keep hearing about in this kind of ecological sustainability realm. And that's the one I've just started, because I want to finish Small Farm Future and then read Overshoot, because Overshoot seems to be kind of like a Bible of this area. The other book I'm currently reading, which just came out, that I'm loving, I'm absolutely loving, is The Indo-Europeans, Archaeology, Language, Race, and the Search for the Origins of the West. And that's by Jean-Paul Demoule, who's an archaeology professor in France. This book also has really... It's amazing how many fields Indo-European linguistics touches on. Okay, I have 2 more minutes. I don't want to go over an hour. The Foundations of Linguistics, which is basically the most defensible social science in the sense that you can actually predict things based on your analyses. It overlaps with a lot of the racism found in the United States. Gobineau's name comes up again, shockingly. And then the part I'm on now is right after de Saussure, the Swiss linguist, structuralism and all that. Talks about Roman Jakobson and Trubetsky, I think that's his name. Fascinating guy from Lithuania, but I'm going to finish this book in the next couple of days, and I'll also be able to talk about that if I make a video about it. All right, so that's all my books. Quick run through of books I bought recently. Biography of Franco, Paul Preston, authoritative one available. Joseph Wright, a Middle High German primer. Joseph Wright was the mentor to J.R.R. Tolkien. Speaking of, this is J.R.R. Tolkien's most important academic work, the Ankrene Vissa. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but this is a guide to anchoresses, female anchorites in the Middle Ages. And this is the published by one of my favorite publishers, the Early English Text Society. So very pleased to find that. And finally, the selected poems of Marina Tsvetaeva, one of my favorite 20th century poets. All right, well, let me know what you think about anything I said in this video, stuff I've been thinking about a lot lately. And it reminds me of a quote that I can't distinctly remember by George Gross. He talks about, we live in a man-eating world and artists are content playing with ornaments on the sidelines. So I've pretty much had enough of ornaments. All right, death is a gang boss.